Here's a problem where we have to add our rational expressions. Okay, we're adding two rational expressions. And remember, rational expressions are just big fractions. Okay, they're a fraction where you have a polynomial inside of it. We call those rational expressions. Now, you know, in order to add fractions or rational expressions, your denominator has to be exactly the same. Now, when you look at these two, are these exactly the same? No, they're not. So these are what we call, they're not like denominators, but we call them similar denominators. And that's because, well, they both have an x, right? Yeah. And they both have a 3, right? Yeah. But they're not exactly the same. So what's wrong with this is that this denominator here is not in order. This one's fine. My x comes first, then my constant. But this one is not. So let's go ahead, let's get it in order. All right, the first fraction just drops down, 5 over x minus 3, plus, and then this fraction over here is going to be 6 over, we're going to bring the x out in front, x is going to be first, and let's remember this is a negative x, so it's going to be negative x, and then the 3, and remember that this is a positive 3. There's no negative out in front, so this is a positive 3. So negative x plus 3. Now, the next thing to notice is that if you look at this denominator as a polynomial, we never want a leading coefficient that's negative. And right now, the leading coefficient is a negative 1. So we need to factor that negative 1 out, just like we would if it was a greatest common factor. That's our next step. So let's see, plus 6 over, let's take that negative 1 out. And when we divide the first term by negative 1, it'll be a positive x. And when we divide the second term by negative 1, it'll be a minus 3. All right, now, the denominators look similar. They look pretty much the same except for this, the negative 1. And what we can do is we can take this negative 1 and we can bring it to the top of the fraction, to the numerator. Okay, let me take just a second to remind you of this. If you have a fraction, negative 2 over 3, there's 3 ways we can write this. We can leave it as the negative 1 in the numerator, that's fine. We can bring the negative out in front, that's also okay. Or we could have the negative in the denominator, which is the least preferred method. Okay, mathematically, this is the best method. This one is okay, and this one is not what we want. But what I'm trying to show you here is that you can have the negative in the bottom or in the top, and it's the same thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this negative 1, and we're going to move it to the numerator. So I have 5 over x minus 3 plus a negative 6 over x minus 3. Okay, this is really a negative 1 times 6, which is a negative 6. So if you wanted to write it like that, you could write it like that. Let's see. Let's write it like negative 1 times 6. Okay, now our denominators are exactly the same, and we're ready to put it together. So let's do it. All over one common denominator of x minus 3, and I'm going to have 5 plus a negative 6, which is 5 minus 6, which is negative 1. And here is my answer.